Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Alex Hutchinson about the explorer's gene, why we seek big challenges, new flavors, and the blank spots on the map. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Alex Hutchinson is the New York Times-bestselling author of Endure, a longtime columnist for Outside, covering the science of endurance, and a National Magazine award-winning journalist who's contributed to the New York Times, the New Yorker, and others. He joins us to talk about the explorer's gene, why we seek big challenges, new flavors, and the blank spots on the map. Alex, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's great to be here.
Well, before we talk about some specific things you raise in this book, give us an overview. What are readers going to find here?
This book was my attempt to understand why we're drawn to new things, to unfamiliar things, to the unknown. So ranging from why do we sail across the Atlantic looking for new continents to when we're sitting in a familiar restaurant, why do we kind of think, oh, maybe I should order that thing that I've never ordered before, even though it might be better, but it might also be worse than the dish I've had before.
Well, you are known for pushing your limits. So what compelled you to write this book?
You know, I mean, I've always been drawn to, pretending that I'm exploring on vacations, to going out in the backcountry, to canoeing and to backpacking and things like that. But I think what sparked me to work on the book was realizing it was actually a sort of career decisions. What should I write my next book about? And realizing that I'd been writing about endurance for about 10 years and that I wanted to do something different. And I couldn't understand why. I thought, I love endurance. Why don't I want to just keep doing the same thing? There's something that's calling me. And I sort of drew the connections between these, the way I vacation, the way I order in restaurants, and the way I was guiding my career, and thought, why is this? What is it inside us that pushes us in that direction?
Well, you address this in the first part of your book, which is why we explore. So as you did your research, what did you discover about human nature and why we want to explore?
Yeah, I think I started with the assumption that of course we're drawn to the unknown. But once I started to think about it, I realized it's not that obvious. Because oak trees have spread around the world just like humans, but no one says, "Oh, the acorn," and it's dreaming of the far horizon. And so I really wanted to try and understand: is there something innately human about this desire to follow the uncharted path? And I came to the conclusion that there is. That you can look at the way humans have spread, not just over land masses, but across oceans and things like that. Like Polynesia to me was a big smoking gun. You don't end up on Easter Island because it's a little crowded in your local neighborhood. You really have to be looking for it, setting out to explore. And so I think that's something over the last 50,000 years or so that separates humans from pretty much any other species on the planet.
And in your book, you talk about sort of the psychological payoff of when we do explore and expand our horizons. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, really, there's when people ask, like, why do we explore? There's two basic ways of answering that question. One is that it leads us to good things. We discover new continents and new cuisines and things like that, and it's a sort of rational payoff. The other is because it's satisfying, because it feels good, because it brings meaning to our lives. And I think those two motivations have historically been aligned in the same way that sweet things taste good. We're wired to enjoy the taste of sugar because it's a good source of calories. Now, in the modern world, we've learned that those two things don't always go together. That just because something tastes good doesn't mean it's good for us. And I think the same thing is true for exploring. That sometimes exploring is good in a tactical sense. It allows you to discover good things. It also feels good, and that's a good reason. The pursuit of challenge and meaning. But not to wander off onto a tangent, but we worry about social media these days and addictive screens, and I think part of that is it's managed to hijack our exploring circuitry in a way that doesn't bring us good things, and it's sort of like the junk. It's the cognitive equivalent of junk food that's appealing to our taste buds.
Yeah, you're right. It's kind of like junk food exploring in a way. It's because
that's right. You feel good for a second, but you're not left satisfied.
Right, but you're constantly moving on. Like what they call the doom scroll, because it's something new, it's something different. You're being exposed to different things, but ultimately, It's not giving you the kind of reward that if you were out there in the real world doing things yourself.
Yeah. And so, when I've talked to neuroscientists about why are we drawn to new things, it's well, fundamentally, you're trying to learn about the world. That this is the way we survive as an organism, is to learn about the world. And so to be drawn to the path we know least about is a great way of learning about the world. But this junk food version of exploring is it's giving us the feedback of, oh, hey, you pressed scroll and you learned something new. But in fact, we're not learning anything about the world in that sense. So it's giving us the illusion of exploring without teaching us anything useful that can make us better people or allow us to thrive in the world.
I want to come back to something you mentioned before. Is that idea? It's like you go to a restaurant and you try to decide, well, do I get the thing I always get or do I try something new? And you talk about that in terms of the explore versus exploit sort of dilemma. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, this is it's a fundamental choice that we face on many different scales. So sitting in a restaurant, we explore, and we either exploit the knowledge we have and take advantage of that, or we explore something new. The terminology actually comes from a paper written in the early 90s by a Stanford business prof about the way companies make decisions. Or should they exploit their current product line by spending money, on marketing, or should they explore? Should they invest in R&D to build a new product that will, make their company thrive in a decade? But both are important. It's not that exploring is always the right answer. There's lots of situations where you should take advantage of what you've discovered by exploring and exploit that knowledge and that know-how. Getting the balances right is tricky, and there's no universal answer. But the general argument that arises from this research is that we tend to undervalue exploration because the returns are delayed. So if you exploit your current knowledge, right away you get you spend money on marketing. Hey, our sales went up. You spend money on R&D. You don't even know how it's going to turn out for maybe 5 years or longer.
I'm talking with Alex Hutchinson about the explorer's gene, why we seek big challenges, new flavors, and the blank spots on the map. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you're enjoying this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. And thank you. And there's the risk factor. If you're exploring new things and if you're risk averse, maybe you don't want to do that.
Yeah, one of the really fascinating pieces of research that I came across was an analysis of food delivery orders from a company called Deliveroo, which is kind of like Uber Eats. They explored something like 1.8 million food delivery orders to understand what factors affect how we order and what we think about it. And exploring has a cost. If you try a restaurant that you've never tried before, odds are it's going to be a worse meal than if you stick with one of your current favorites. You have a lower chance of getting a 5-star meal. So you might say, well, if exploring is a bad idea, then we get worse meals. But in the long range, in the long term, if you persistently explore, you get some bad meals, you get some good meals, you get some great meals. And so over time, you can discard the duds and keep the great ones. And so exploring pays off in the long term, but you have to be willing to accept the chance or actually the probability of a bad meal in the short term.
Another thing you talked about, which kind of surprised me, and that's this idea that we're having a creativity crisis because in some ways we're exposed to so many different ideas and so many different things you would think that would spur creative thought. But instead, you're finding that it's kind of the opposite. What's going on there?
Yeah, there's a few different strands of evidence. One is that just like IQ tests, there's a standard set of tests called the Torrance tests, which test creativity. And scores have been dropping on that test in kids since the 90s. And it's actually gotten dramatically worse, a steeper decline since about 2012. So something seems to be going on. And then you can connect that to, there's big analyses of scientific papers and patents, of millions of patents and papers, finding, and asking how likely are these papers or patents to be disruptive, to really change the course instead of just adding on incrementally to what we already know. And the number of, or the rate of disruptive papers and patents is going down too. Now, it's hard to keep inventing new things forever. We know a lot about the world. So, maybe there's something about that. But the scientists who study the sort of creativity tests, their suspicion is that it has something to do with the decline of free play, of just not goal oriented. Let's go to the, sign our kids up to learn how to code or whatever, but out in the park, just learning to follow your own curiosity. Because if the goal, going back to this idea that the goal of exploring is to learn about the world, we have a very sensitive way of detecting whether we're learning about the world, whether something is new, and that is whether it's interesting and fun. And kids these days, and adults too, I think it's harder and harder to find space to let yourself just ask, is this interesting to me?
What's interesting to me about that is that it seems counterintuitive that you might think, oh, well, I need to study specific things. Like I said, maybe my kid needs to learn about coding because that's going to make them more creative. Instead, because they might look at the kid just hanging out and they think, well, he's not doing anything, so why is this important? But in fact, you're saying that is really critical to creative development.
Yeah. People talk about the freedom to be bored, or the ability to tolerate being bored, because that's when your mind might go in some unexpected places, when it's not always being spoon-fed from an algorithm. This will keep you entertained. This will save you the trouble of thinking. But there's another stream of research in the book which asks what leads to breakthroughs, which suggests that the best combination is to have some exploration followed by some exploitation. So it's not that you don't need to work hard. It's not that you don't need to buckle down sometimes and decide to really pursue a narrow avenue. But the best way to find the right avenue is to have had time to explore beforehand. So to cast your net widely, to let your kid chase butterflies for a while and figure out what it is they like to do before you sign them up for the intensive course.
Another area you talk about is the idea of, sort of passive versus active exploration. We can be an armchair traveler, but that's not the same as going there ourselves.
Yeah, and one way to think about this is think about being a driver in a car versus a passenger in a car. And even if you drive the same route every morning, let's say you're in a carpool or whatever, who knows the neighborhood better, the person who's driving or the person who's sitting, the kid sitting in the back seat? And there's actually fascinating studies asking kids to draw maps of their neighborhoods. And the kids who are driven to school, it's the map of their neighborhood is like, here's my house, here's a straight line, here's my school, that's my neighborhood. They you don't have to look around when you're passive. And so you can say, what's the difference between climbing Mount Everest by yourself, being carried up by a team of Sherpas, or watching a National Geographic documentary about Mount Everest? The truth is, you'll probably know more about Mount Everest by watching the documentary. Like they do a great job, but there's something fundamentally different if you're not making decisions yourselves in some way. So I think there's a big societal trend that it predates the internet, that away from participating and towards watching. It's not no longer that every town has a town band and a town baseball team, and now we all just watch the same 10 people who are the best in the world at it. And I think there's something lost in not having that opportunity to make your own mistakes, to make your own decisions.
Another factor that you talk about regarding exploration is age and exploration. What does the research tell us there?
Yeah, the funny thing is, or not, maybe not the funny thing is, the sobering thing is that if you think of it as a strictly mathematical problem, what the math suggests is that, yeah, you should explore less and less as you get older, because when you're young, if you discover something new and useful, you have a long time to take advantage of that discovery. As you get older, you have a shorter and shorter time horizon. So you may think, why would I bother listening to new music at this point? I've already got lots of music I like. I should just listen to my favorites and never discover anything new. So there's a logic and there's a rationality to that. It makes sense that kids are super exploratory. But there's a danger in taking that logic too far. And when scientists study exploratory behavior as a function of age, they find that there's a subset, in some samples, about 20% of older adults who really become averse to exploration, to trying anything new or trying anything where there's some uncertainty. And that, I think, is taking that logic a little bit too far, because for one thing, lifespans are longer than they used to be. You never know how many more years you've got left. And so you might as well keep looking for new and exciting things, because you may have 1 or 2 or 3 or however many more decades to enjoy whatever it is you discover.
And there's lots of research to say that you need to stay mentally active as an older adult. And learning new things is part of that. Experiencing new things is part of that. So, yeah, you can't maybe do some of the physical exploration you could do when you were younger, but there are a lot of other things you can explore that will keep you vital in your old age.
Yeah, and I think, one of the insights that stuck with me is the idea that exploring physical landscapes and exploring ideas, it's really using the same parts of the brain. So there's not some fundamental difference where, oh, if you're not out there in the jungle trying to find a new path, you're not finding your way around. But by going around our neighborhoods or by listening to new books or learning new skills, we're using those parts of the brain, and those parts of the brain are important. They're like the hippocampus in particular. It's linked with, keeping an active hippocampus is linked with staving off cognitive decline and all sorts of other conditions like that. So to me, it really motivates. I'll tell you, like on a practical level, one of the things it motivated me to do is, okay, I'm not going to use turn-by-turn directions in my car unless I need them. I'm going to try and, figure out where I'm going. And then if you're not using turn-by-turn directions, you find you really have to be looking around and taking in your surroundings. And that's using a part of your brain that's very important.
Well, this is a fascinating book, and we've only scratched the surface here. There's so much more in the book. So what would you say are some of the key takeaways you hope readers are going to still think about after they've finished this book?
One of the, again, I spent a lot of time going into the math of exploration. How do you know when it's right to explore or exploit? And there's no simple answer. The truth is, I tried hard to find simple answers. There's no simple answer. But as general rules of thumb, the one that really stuck with me is, basically, they call it optimism in the face of uncertainty. And this is a sort of mathematically proven way of actually minimizing regret, which is when you're choosing between two paths or two alternatives, think about what's the best realistic outcome for each of these. And if you're optimistic and say, I think this one, maybe they're equal in some ways, but this one, if things go right, it has a better long-term payoff. Be optimistic and go for that one. It's kind of like looking back, you're never going to regret, or you're going to regret far more if you don't ask someone to dance than if you ask them and they say no, which sometimes happens. Like it's not that everything works out, but if you are willing to embrace a little bit of uncertainty and the possibility of failure, you're likely to be happier with your decisions in the long run.
To learn more, the book is The Explorer's Gene: Why We Seek Big Challenges, New Flavors, and the Blank Spots on the Map. It's by Alex Hutchinson. Alex, thank you for talking with me today.
Thanks, Dan. This was a lot of fun conversation.
If you would like to purchase The Explorer's Gene, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.